Arizona Territory, 1875. A time when westward expansion collided with ancient traditions, when dreams of new beginnings could transform into nightmares in the blink of an eye. The unforgiving desert stood as both pathway and barrier, promising opportunity to some while demanding terrible sacrifice from others. In this harsh and beautiful landscape, survival depended not just on strength, but on wisdom, passed down through generations of those who had learned to hear the desert's whispers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elizabeth Hoffman stared at the horizon where the setting sun painted the vast Arizona sky in shades of amber and crimson. At 26, the young widow carried more than just her small valise and the teaching credentials that had secured her position in Santa Fe. Beneath her carefully loosened travel dress, she concealed a 5-month pregnancy, evidence of a brief romance with a married railroad investor who had promised much but delivered nothing when confronted with the consequences. Philadelphia society had no place for a fallen schoolteacher. The West, with its promise of reinvention and desperate need for educated women, offered Beth her only chance at building a life for herself and her child. When the Richardson Wagon train had accepted her application to join their journey to Santa Fe, she had nearly wept with relief. 15 families with dreams as vast as the territory they crossed had welcomed the quiet, well-spoken widow without prying into her circumstances. The evening brought an unusual chill to the desert, the temperature dropping rapidly as the sun disappeared behind distant mesas. Beth gathered kindling at the edge of their camp, her mind wandering to the future she hoped to create. The child had quickened just days earlier, a strange, fluttering sensation that transformed the abstract idea of motherhood into something wonderfully, terrifyingly real. "Mrs. Hoffman, you shouldn't wander so far alone," called Marcus Richardson, the wagon master who had taken a protective interest in her welfare. "We'll be entering Shadow Canyon Pass tomorrow. Best everyone stays close tonight." Beth nodded, gathering the final pieces of wood for the evening fire. The wagons were arranged in their customary circle, a fragile barrier against whatever might lurk in the gathering darkness. Most travelers were settling in for the night, preparing simple meals or tending to livestock. Only the sentries remained, fully alert, rifles ready as they scanned the perimeter. The first shot shattered the twilight calm like thunder cracking directly overhead. Beth instinctively dropped to the ground, the kindling scattering from her apron as more shots followed. In rapid succession, through the sparse desert brush, she could see riders charging into the circle of wagons. At least 15 men, faces concealed by bandanas, firing indiscriminately into the camp. "Indians!" someone shouted, though in the chaos, Beth couldn't identify the voice. But even in her terror, something struck her as wrong. The attackers moved with military precision, their horses responding to subtle commands rather than vocal calls. Their aim was deliberate, targeting the men first, then anyone who appeared capable of resistance. Marcus Richardson fell defending the Geller children, his body crumpling near the main campfire. The Bartons tried to flee toward the small creek that had determined their camping location, but 2 riders intercepted them, cutting them down before they'd managed 10 paces. Their bodies collapsed in a terrible heap, night clothes darkening with blood in the fading light. Beth pressed herself against the earth, one hand protectively covering her swollen belly. She had fallen beyond the firelight's reach, concealed by the desert scrub and deepening shadows. From this position, the massacre unfolded with horrific clarity. Mrs. Wilkes dragged screaming from her wagon. The Cooper twins gunned down as they reached for their father's rifle. The Sullivan infant wailing until its cries were suddenly, sickeningly silenced. The raiders moved methodically through the camp, killing first, then looting with calculated efficiency. They took only valuables, money, jewelry, watches, and weapons. They ignored food stores and personal effects, suggesting this wasn't a raid born of necessity, but of calculated greed. "Check the perimeter," a deep voice commanded. "Make sure we got all of them." Beth's heart hammered against her ribs. She began to inch backward through the scrub, moving with excruciating slowness away from camp. The rocky soil scratched her palms, the chill of the desert night seeping through her dress. 20 yards, 30. The sounds of destruction continued behind her. When she judged herself far enough away, Beth risked rising to a crouch. The desert brush stood taller than her bent form, providing meager cover as she navigated toward a dry wash that cut through the landscape. Each step was agony, her pregnant body awkward and unwieldy in her desperation to flee. A horse whinnied uncomfortably close. Beth froze. "Nothing over here, Rawlins," a voice called, no more than 15 yards from where she stood, immobilized with terror. "Get back here then. We're burning the wagons." Beth remained motionless until the hoofbeats receded, then continued her painstaking retreat toward the wash. By the time she reached it, orange flames illuminated the night sky. The raiders had set fire to the wagons, erasing evidence of their specific crimes, though not the broader atrocity. From the relative safety of the wash, Beth watched as the murderers mounted up and rode south, their saddlebags heavy with stolen valuables. Only when they disappeared behind a distant ridge did she allow herself to collapse against the sandy bank, her body convulsing with silent sobs. Hours passed before she found the courage to return to what remained of the camp. The wagons still smoldered, reduced to blackened frames and ash. Bodies lay where they had fallen, vacant eyes reflecting the cold light of the rising moon. Beth moved among them like a ghost, searching for survivors, though she knew she would find none. She had witnessed the thoroughness of the slaughter. In a haze of shock, she gathered what supplies she could salvage: a canteen half full of water, a small hunting knife that had been kicked beneath a wagon wheel, a singed blanket, and a packet of matches she found in Marcus Richardson's vest pocket. She couldn't bring herself to take anything else from the dead. The vastness of her predicament settled over her as she stood amid the devastation. She was alone, pregnant, in hostile territory, at least 80 miles from the nearest settlement. If the elements didn't kill her, starvation would, or perhaps the raiders would return to ensure no witnesses remained. Yet beneath the crushing weight of circumstance, something hardened in Elizabeth Hoffman. The child within her moved again, a gentle reminder of her responsibility to more than just herself. She had not survived by chance, only to surrender to despair. With the meager supplies bundled into the blanket, Beth studied her surroundings. The Richardson train had been following the old Spanish trail northward, planning to connect with a larger route that would take them west toward Santa. The logic dictated she should continue north toward Fort Collins, where she might find protection. She took a final look at the charred remains of the camp, silently promising the dead that she would survive to tell of what happened here. Then, with the moon high overhead, Beth turned her face northward and began to walk. The first day passed in a fog of shock and physical strain. Beth forced herself to move at a steady pace, rationing sips from the canteen, watching for prickly pear and other desert plants she recognized as sources of moisture. As dusk approached, she sought shelter in a shallow cave formed by wind-eroded sandstone, wrapping herself in the salvaged blanket against the desert night's penetrating cold. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by nightmares of the mornings, horror and the very real sounds of wildlife moving in the darkness beyond her shelter. Coyotes yipped and howled in the distance, their cries echoing off canyon walls like lost souls calling to one another. Dawn brought no comfort, only the stark reality of another day of survival. Beth's feet, encased in delicate leather boots, never intended for such terrain, had developed painful blisters that burst and reformed with each mile. Her back ached from the combined burden of pregnancy and walking. The meager rations she had salvaged would last perhaps another day if carefully measured. Yet she pressed on, following the trail's course, counting each step as a small victory against death. The child moved more frequently now, as if sensing her determination and adding its own. "We'll make it," she whispered, one hand on her belly, as she navigated a particularly steep section of trail. "I promise you that." By the third day, Beth's situation had grown dire. The canteen held only a few precious swallows, though she had found a small seep the previous evening that had allowed her to drink deeply. Food was the greater concern. She had finished the last of her salvage supplies that morning and had found little to forage along the day's journey. Hunger gnawed at her insides, distinct from and yet compounding the discomfort of her pregnancy. The weather, too, had turned against her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dark clouds gathered over the mesas, bringing an unseasonable chill. The first raindrops hit as Beth struggled up a rock-strewn incline, her strength already flagging. Within minutes, the drizzle became a downpour. Beth's thin dress, already tattered from days of wilderness travel, offered little protection against the deluge. The blanket wrapped around her shoulders grew sodden and heavy. Her hair hung in dripping tendrils around her face, and her teeth chattered uncontrollably. "Keep moving," she commanded herself. "Just keep moving." But toward what? The question haunted her with increasing urgency. Fort Collins remained days away, perhaps a week at her current pace. In her weakened state, with dwindling resources and worsening weather, the odds of reaching it diminished with each passing hour. As afternoon faded toward evening, the rain finally relented, though the skies remained threatening. Beth found herself on a high mesa overlooking a sweeping valley. In the distance, perhaps 4 miles away, a thin column of smoke rose against the gray backdrop of clouds. Her heart leaped at the sign of human presence, then immediately constricted with fear. Smoke meant fire, fire meant people. But what people? The settlers, soldiers, or perhaps the very raiders who had destroyed the Richardson train? Beth sank onto a boulder, weighing her options. Approaching strangers carried obvious risks, especially after what she had witnessed. Yet continuing alone, weakened by hunger and exposure, offered only the certainty of eventual failure. As she deliberated, a wave of dizziness washed over her. Beth gripped the rock beneath her, waiting for it to pass. When it didn't, when in fact it intensified, a new fear took hold. The child. Something was wrong. A sharp cramp seized her. Lower abdomen, doubling her over with its intensity. Too early, she thought frantically. It's too early. When the pain subsided, Beth raised her head and stared at the distant smoke. The decision had been made for her. She needed help, whatever. The risk. Gathering her remaining strength, she began the descent toward the valley floor, each step measured and careful on the rain-slicked terrain. The distant smoke became her beacon, her only hope in a wilderness that had already taken so much from her. She had covered perhaps half the distance when another cramp struck, more powerful than the first. Beth dropped to her knees with a cry, clutching her belly as pain radiated through her core. When it passed, she noticed with horror a small dampness between her legs. Not rain, something else. "Please," she whispered to whatever gods might be listening. "Please, not now." The sky darkened as she struggled onward, the smoke now lost in the gathering gloom. Beth navigated by memory and instinct, hoping she maintained the correct direction. The cramping returned intermittently, each episode more debilitating than the last. Night had fully descended when Beth's legs finally gave way beneath her. She collapsed beside a juniper tree, her strength completely spent. The thin blanket offered meager protection against the night air, which carried the bite of approaching frost. She curled around her swollen belly, shivering uncontrollably, her mind clouding with the combined effects of exhaustion, hunger, and fear. This is how it ends, she thought with surprising clarity. After everything, this is how we die. Beth closed her eyes, allowing exhaustion to pull her toward unconsciousness. As darkness claimed her, she thought she detected movement nearby, a shadow separating from deeper shadows. Then a crack of a twig, the soft exhale of breath, not her own. Her eyes flew open, hand fumbling for the small knife at her waist. But weakness betrayed her, and the blade slipped from nerveless fingers. Beth's vision tunneled, the world contracting to a single point before expanding into complete darkness. Her last conscious thought was not of fear, but of a strange certainty. She was no longer alone in the wilderness. What Beth couldn't know as consciousness fled was that the eyes watching from the darkness belonged to someone who would forever alter the course of her life. Someone neither friend nor foe, but something altogether different. Someone whose own path had led to this precise moment of intersection with her desperate journey. The figure moved forward silently, kneeling beside Beth's crumpled form. A weathered hand, gentle but sure, reached out to check for signs of life. "Hojo nahasli," a voice murmured in Navajo. "The spirits have brought us together, Bilagana. Now we must see what they intend." Consciousness returned to Beth in fragments, the scent of sage and juniper, warmth against her chilled skin, the soft crackling of a small fire. For a moment, she thought herself back in Philadelphia, in her childhood bedroom during a winter illness, her mother tending the hearth. Reality reasserted itself when she tried to move. Pain radiated through her body, centered most intensely in her abdomen. The child. With a gasp, Beth's hands flew to her belly, panic rising like floodwater. "Be still," a deep female voice instructed. "The medicine works, but needs time." Beth's eyes snapped open. She lay on a bed of fragrant cedar boughs beneath a small lean-to of branches and hides. Beyond the shelter's opening, stars punctured the night sky with startling clarity. The fire that had warmed her cast dancing shadows across her surroundings and across the face of the woman who knelt beside her. She was tall even in her crouched position, with strong features and the distinctive copper skin of the native peoples. Her black hair, streaked with a single band of silver, was braided with small objects woven into the strands. Feathers, beads, what looked like tiny bones. She wore a mixture of traditional clothing and items clearly obtained from white traders. A long skirt of indigo cloth, a blouse adorned with intricate beadwork, and a necklace of turquoise and silver that caught the firelight as she moved. But it was her eyes that captured Beth's attention. Dark, deeply set beneath strong brows, regarding her with a mixture of clinical assessment and genuine concern. Beth tried to retreat, to put distance between herself and this stranger, but her body refused to cooperate. Fear closed her throat. "The child stays," the woman said, correctly interpreting her panic. "But angry spirits entered your body, brought early pains." She gestured to a small clay pot near the fire. "Medicine drives spirits away. You sleep, they leave." Her English was accented but clear, each word carefully chosen and delivered with deliberate precision. "Who?" Beth began, her voice a rasping whisper. "I am called Nijoni by my people," she answered. "Some whites call me Jenny." A hint of distaste crossed her features at the imposed name. "I am Dine. Hatawi." She paused, searching for the English equivalent. "Medicine. Woman healer." Beth's gaze darted around their small shelter, seeking some sign of threat or ill intent. Finding none, she allowed herself to relax marginally against the cedar boughs. "Elizabeth," she offered cautiously. "Elizabeth Hoffman." Nijoni nodded once, acknowledging the exchange of names as a small but significant trust. "How did you find me?" Beth asked. "Spirits show the way," she said simply. Then, perhaps seeing the skepticism in Beth's face, she elaborated. 3 days ago, vision came while in prayer. Woman with child alone, death walking beside her, spirits say, find her. She shrugged as if such guidance were commonplace. I follow signs. Broken brush, disturbed earth. Then find you half dead beneath juniper. Beth processed this, uncertain how much to credit the woman's talk of spirits and visions. What mattered was that she had found her, had apparently treated her somehow, and had not harmed her despite ample opportunity. The raiders, she said suddenly, the memory of the massacre flooding back. Did you see the men on horseback? Njoni's expression darkened. Bad men. Not the first time they kill. Take what is not theirs. You know about them. She nodded, gravely. They attacked a Dine hunting camp last moon, killed 3 men, 1 woman, say it was army soldiers who did this. Her eyes met Beth's directly. Wear blue coats sometimes when they kill Indians. Wear feathers and paint when they kill whites. Her gaze was penetrating. Make both sides hate each other more. A chill ran through Beth despite the fire's warmth. These men were not just opportunistic killers, but calculating instigators of conflict, playing both sides against each other for their own benefit. I have to reach a settlement, she said. Tell someone what happened. These men can't be allowed to continue. Njoni studied her for a long moment. You are a witness, she stated rather than asked. Yes. Dangerous. They know someone escaped. They hunt you now. As if to emphasize her point, a distant coyote howled, the sound echoing across the valley. Njoni rose and moved to the fire, returning with a wooden cup filled with steaming liquid. Drink, she instructed. Strengthens blood, calms child's spirit. Beth hesitated, eyeing the dark brew warily. If I wanted harm, Njoni said with unexpected gentleness, would have left you to die. The logic was irrefutable. Beth accepted the cup, inhaling the unfamiliar aroma, earthy, with hints of mint and something more pungent. She sipped cautiously. The taste was bitter but not unpleasant, reminiscent of strong tea mixed with wild herbs. As she drank, Njoni checked a poultice she had applied to Beth's feet, her movements clinical and respectful. Bad wounds, she commented. White women's shoes not made for desert walking. Despite everything, Beth found herself smiling faintly at the observation. No, she agreed. They are not. When she had finished the medicinal tea, exhaustion descended swiftly. Her eyelids grew heavy, though she fought to remain alert. Sleep now, Njoni said, rising to add wood to the fire. Tomorrow, we will talk about where to go. We, Beth managed, already drifting, cannot leave a woman with child alone in Apache territory, she replied. Not honorable. Dawn arrived with pale fingers of light reaching through the pine boughs of the shelter. Beth awoke, feeling considerably stronger, the cramping in her abdomen reduced to a dull ache. She sat up cautiously, testing her body's limits. Njoni materialized beside the shelter, carrying freshly filled water skins. She nodded approval at Beth's improved condition. Medicine works, she said, setting down her burden. Child's spirit calm now. Beth placed a protective hand over her rounded belly, feeling the reassuring movement within. Thank you, she said, the words inadequate for saving 2 lives. Njoni acknowledged her gratitude with a slight inclination of her head. She knelt beside the remains of the night's fire, skillfully coaxing it back to life with dry tinder and steady breaths. How far is the nearest settlement? Beth asked, watching her work. Fort Collins, 4 days north, Army Post. She glanced at Beth, her expression revealing her thoughts on the destination. Or Dine Winter Camp, 3 days east. My people. The choice was unexpected. Beth had assumed she would be guided to white civilization, the logical destination. For a white woman in distress, That Nijoni offered her own community as an alternative suggested a trust she hadn't anticipated. Would your people welcome me? The question seemed absurd given the history between natives and settlers, but Nijoni considered it seriously. Some yes, some no. Chief Standing Cloud is a wise man, but careful with whites. Her hands moved methodically, preparing a morning meal of dried meat softened in hot water with wild onions. You carry the witness burden, important to both peoples. Beth understood the implication. Her testimony about the raiders' tactics of disguising themselves as either military or natives to incite conflict would be valuable to the Navajo as well as to white authorities. Which would you recommend? She asked. Nijoni paused her work, studying Beth with unexpected intensity. Depends on what kind of truth you seek. Fort has soldiers. Protection also has men who don't listen to Indians or to women. She handed Beth a portion of the morning meal. Camp has my people's protection, different kind but strong. They will listen, but cannot take action against white raiders except in defense. Eat. Strength returns to your body. We will decide the path after. The food was simple but filling, and Beth ate with the appreciation of one who had faced starvation. As she did, she studied her unexpected savior more carefully in the daylight. Nijoni was older than she had initially judged, perhaps 50, with weathered features that spoke of a life lived primarily outdoors. A scar ran along her right jaw, pale against her copper skin. Her hands, though capable of surprising gentleness, when treating Beth's wounds, bore the calluses and small scars of a lifetime of practical work. Yet there was an undeniable dignity in her bearing, a centeredness that Beth had rarely encountered. She moved with deliberate economy, wasting neither motion nor resources. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of careful consideration. How did you become a healer? Beth asked, curiosity overcoming her natural reserve. Nijoni seemed surprised by the question, as if few whites had ever expressed interest in her life. Born during winter moon, when spirits walk close to the world, she began, her English flowing more freely with the personal narrative. As a child, I often saw things others did not. Animal spirits, ancestor shadows. Medicine woman of the tribe recognized the gift and took me to learn ways of healing. Her fingers absently touched the turquoise necklace. Spent 15 winters learning plants, ceremonies, spirit calling. She fell silent, and Beth sensed there was more to the story, something personal that had deepened her commitment to healing. And the English? She prompted instead. A shadow crossed Nijoni's features. Government took children from many tribes, put in white schools to civilize us. The bitterness in the final word was unmistakable. I was older, but they took me too. 3 years at Santa Fe Indian School. She looked into the fire, learned white men's words, numbers, stories, learned how white men think, what they value. You escaped, Beth guessed. Nijoni nodded. During the night, walked for many days back to my people. Her gaze returned to Beth, unexpectedly direct. Knowledge is useful, though. Move between worlds now. Help my people understand white ways. Prepare for changes coming. The conversation paused as Nijoni rose to check something outside their shelter. When she returned, her expression had shifted to one of alert concern. We must go, she said, gathering her few possessions with practiced efficiency. Riders coming from the south, many horses. Fear surged through Beth. The raiders, not taking chances with a child carrier's life. She handed Beth a pair of soft moccasins to replace her ruined boots. Tracks found yesterday, fresh camp signs. The urgency in her voice dispelled any thought of argument. With Nijoni's assistance, Beth struggled to her feet, testing the unfamiliar footwear. The moccasins felt strange, but infinitely more comfortable than her blistered feet had been in her boots. Nijoni efficiently dismantled their shelter, dispersing the pine boughs and dousing the fire with dirt. Within minutes, little evidence remained of their overnight stay. "Can you walk?" she asked, surveying Beth's condition. Beth took a few experimental steps. Her body protested, muscles stiff from days of exertion, followed by collapse, but the terrible weakness had receded. "Yes," she said with more confidence than she felt. Nijoni nodded approval. "We follow the ridge east," she said, pointing toward a line of hills. "Hard path, but hides our trail. Dine Camp is safest now." "I'll slow you down," Beth said, reality asserting itself as she considered the journey ahead. "If they're following us, maybe you should—" "No." Nijoni's response was immediate and final. "Dine do not abandon those in their care, especially women carrying new life." She shouldered her pack and medicine bundle. "Besides, you are a witness. Your words are needed." With that, she started toward the ridge, her pace deliberately measured to accommodate Beth's limitations. Beth followed, each step a testament to her determination to survive, not just for herself now, but for her unborn child, for the murdered members of the Richardson party, and perhaps even for this unexpected alliance with a woman from a world utterly different from her own. They traveled in silence for the first hour, Nijoni setting a sustainable pace that challenged Beth without exhausting her reserves. The terrain grew increasingly difficult as they ascended the ridge, but the moccasins proved their worth, allowing her sure footing where her boots would have failed her. As the sun climbed toward midday, they paused in the shelter of a sandstone outcropping. Nijoni produced strips of dried venison and handed several to Beth. "Twa dilt Louis," she explained. "Good for strength. Eat slowly." Beth chewed the leathery substance, finding it surprisingly flavorful despite its appearance. As they rested, Nijoni scanned the valley below with the keen eye of a practiced hunter. "No signs of pursuit yet," she said finally, "but they are clever hunters." "How did you know they were coming?" Beth asked. "Did you see them?" Nijoni shook her head. "Found camp yesterday while gathering medicine plants. 5 men, heavily armed, not hunters, not trappers." Her expression darkened. "Recognized one, man called Thorn. Rides with raiders sometimes when the main chief is elsewhere." "The main chief?" "Man named Rawlins, Victor Rawlins. Army scout. Once. Now hunts people instead of buffalo." There was a weight to how Nijoni spoke the name, suggesting a history Beth couldn't yet discern. "Very dangerous man. Smart. Cruel." Beth absorbed this information, adding it to the mental record she maintained of the massacre. Names, faces where possible, details that might one day help bring justice. "Why do they do it?" she asked. "Just for valuables?" Nijoni considered her question. "Some men's spirits were broken in war," she said finally. "Return wanting only to hurt others. Take what is not theirs. Others born with darkness inside." She shrugged. "Rawlins is both. Uses war between white settlers and tribes for his benefit." When they resumed their journey, Nijoni led them along game trails so faint Beth would never have identified them without her guidance. She moved with the confident familiarity of one traversing her homeland, occasionally pointing out landmarks or plants of significance. "Four Winds Mesa," she said, indicating a distinctive formation in the distance. "Sacred place, place of visions and healing." Later, she stopped to gather leaves from an unremarkable shrub. "Helps with child carrying," she explained, adding them to her medicine pouch. "Makes a woman's body strong for birth time." Throughout the afternoon, she shared such knowledge casually without presumption or condescension. Beth found herself absorbing not just the information, but the worldview it represented, one where the land was not an adversary to be conquered, but a provider to be respected, where plants were not merely vegetation, but carriers of spirit and healing. As twilight approached, Nijoni selected a campsite beneath a cluster of juniper trees, their dense foliage providing natural concealment. With practiced efficiency, she constructed another lean-to, this one more substantial than the previous night's hasty shelter. "No fire tonight," she said as she worked. "Too visible." Beth nodded, understanding the precaution, though she would miss the warmth. The desert nights grew cold, especially at this elevation. As if reading her thoughts, Nijoni produced a thick rabbit fur robe from her pack, handing it to Beth without ceremony. "Sleep under this. Holds heat better than white man's blanket." "What about you?" Beth asked, noting she had no second. "Robe. Diné women trained from childhood to endure cold," she said simply. "Need less protection." Beth suspected this was at least partly bravado, but accepted the robe with gratitude. The fur was surprisingly soft against her skin, and it retained body heat with remarkable efficiency. As darkness settled fully over the mountains, Nijoni pressed a small object into Beth's hand, a carved stone in the shape of a horned toad, polished smooth by handling. "Protection," she said, "from my mother's mother, strong medicine." Surprised and touched by the gesture, Beth closed her fingers around the carving. "I can't take this. It's a family. Tonight, you need strong medicine more than I do." Nijoni interrupted. "Keep close." With that, she moved to the edge of their small camp, positioning herself where she could watch the approaches. Her silhouette against the starlit sky struck Beth as both protective and somehow lonely. A woman accustomed to existing in the borders between worlds, trusted fully by neither. Exhaustion soon overcame her, despite her complex circumstances. As sleep approached, Beth found herself pondering the strange turn her life had taken. A Philadelphia schoolteacher, pregnant and alone, now depended entirely on the knowledge and protection of a Navajo healer in the Arizona wilderness. What would her proper Philadelphia acquaintances think if they could see her now? The thought brought a surprising smile to her lips as she drifted into slumber, the carved horned toad clutched in her palm like a talisman against the dangers that still pursued them. Dawn broke with a golden glow that painted the mountainside. In warm light, Beth woke to find Nijoni already alert, scanning the terrain below their elevated campsite with the focused intensity of a hawk. The horned toad carving was still clutched in her palm, its smooth contours warm from her body heat. "Good sign," Nijoni said, noticing she held the talisman. "Horned toad spirit watched over your dreams." Beth wasn't sure how much credence to give her spiritual interpretations, but she couldn't deny she'd slept more soundly than expected given their circumstances. She carefully returned the carving to Nijoni. "Thank you for lending me your protection." Nijoni hesitated, then pressed it back into her hand. "Keep until we reach winter camp. Journey not finished." She offered Beth a water skin and more of the dried meat before gesturing eastward. "Long walk today, needs strength." As they prepared to depart, Beth found herself studying the valley below. The beauty of the Arizona wilderness struck her anew, the vast, sweeping panorama of mesa and canyon, desert and sky, all painted in the rich hues of early autumn. How different it appeared in the clear light of day, with Nijoni's steady presence beside her, than it had during her desperate solitary flight. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Your homeland." Nijoni followed her gaze, her expression complex. Pride, mingled with something darker, was larger once, stretched far beyond those mountains. She pointed to distant peaks, now smaller each season. Treaties made, treaties broken. The simple statement carried generations of loss, delivered without self-pity but with undeniable truth. Beth found herself without adequate response. They set off along the ridgeline, Nijoni setting a pace that challenged Beth without overtaxing her. The terrain was difficult, rocky outcroppings, steep inclines, patches of loose shale that threatened treacherous slides. Yet the moccasins provided sure footing, and Beth discovered her body adapting to the demands placed upon it. The physical labor of the journey while taxing brought a clarity of purpose that was almost meditative. Nijoni moved with the easy confidence of someone navigating familiar territory, occasionally pointing out landmarks or signs that would have remained invisible to Beth's untrained eye. "Deer passed here yesterday," she noted, indicating subtle depressions in a patch of soft earth. Later she stopped abruptly, examining a broken branch. "Mountain lion, big one. We go separate ways." By midday, they had descended from the ridge into a narrow valley where a small creek gurgled over smooth stones. Nijoni gestured for a rest, and Beth gratefully sank onto a fallen log, stretching her legs before her. "You walk strong for white. Woman with child," she observed, the statement matter-of-fact rather than congratulatory. "I've had practice these last days," Beth replied with dry humor. A ghost of a smile touched Nijoni's lips, the first Beth had seen. She knelt by the creek, filling their water skins, then produced several bulbous roots from her pack. "Wild onion," she explained, slicing them with her knife. "Good food, medicine too." The roots were starchy and slightly sweet, reminiscent of a mild radish. Beth ate hers gratefully, watching as Nijoni scanned their surroundings with constant vigilance. "Have you always lived in these mountains?" she asked, curious about the woman who had saved her life, yet remained largely a mystery. Nijoni shook her head. "Born near what whites call Canyon de Chelly, sacred land to my people." Her expression grew distant. "When I was a child, soldiers came. The long walk." Beth had heard of this, the forced relocation of the Navajo, people to Bosque Redondo, a brutal 300-mile march in which thousands had died. "We escaped," Nijoni continued. "My family hid in high canyons. Others found us, formed small band living away from reservation, hunting, trading sometimes with Pueblo people." She gestured to the mountains around them. "This became our territory. Not traditional DNA land, but safer, fewer soldiers." Beth tried to imagine the experience, fleeing one's homeland, rebuilding in unfamiliar territory, maintaining culture and traditions despite overwhelming pressure to abandon them. The resilience required seemed almost superhuman. "Your people have suffered greatly," she said simply, knowing no words could adequately address such history. Nijoni looked at her with an assessing gaze. "All peoples suffer. Diné, white settlers, Mexican villagers. The land sees no difference in our blood. When it spills." She rose, indicating it was time to continue their journey. "The difference is in what we learn from suffering." They walked for another hour before Nijoni suddenly raised her hand in a signal to stop. Beth froze, heart accelerating as Nijoni dropped to a crouch, motioning for her to do the same. "What is it?" Beth whispered. "Riders," Nijoni breathed, "in the canyon ahead." They edged forward carefully until they reached a vantage point where they could see into the canyon below. 3 mounted men moved slowly along the creek bed, clearly following tracks. Even at this distance, Beth could see they carried rifles at the ready. "Rawlins' men?" she asked. Though she already knew the answer, Nijoni nodded grimly. "Found our trail, faster than I thought." She studied the terrain with calculating eyes. "Must change direction, no direct path to winter camp now." She pointed to a rocky escarpment to the north. "That way. Hard climbing, but they cannot follow on horses." The detour would add days to their journey, but Beth understood the necessity. If the raiders caught them, there would be no journey at all, only a quick and merciless end to their flight. They retreated carefully from their observation point, then began the arduous climb up the escarpment. The going was painfully slow. Beth's pregnant body was ill-suited to scrambling over rocks, and several times Nijoni had to physically assist her over difficult sections. By the time they reached the top, both women were breathing heavily from exertion. "Rest," Nijoni instructed, allowing Beth to sink onto a flat rock while she stood watch, seemingly tireless despite the climb. From their elevated position, they could see for miles across the rugged landscape. The riders had disappeared into the canyon, still following the trail that now led away from the women's actual location. Yet Beth took little comfort in this temporary advantage. Sooner or later, the skilled trackers would realize they'd lost the trail and begin quartering the area in search of sign. "How far to your people's camp from here?" she asked. Nijoni frowned, calculating. "Direct path, 2 days. This way." Oh, she gestured to the difficult terrain ahead. "Perhaps 4, maybe 5. Beth's heart sank. 5 more days of flight, pursued by determined killers in her weakened condition. The odds seemed increasingly insurmountable. As if sensing her despair, Nijoni knelt beside her. "Do not lose heart, Elizabeth Hoffman. Strong women have walked harder paths." She touched Beth's rounded belly gently. "And you do not walk alone." There was something in the simple assurance that steadied Beth, a quiet certainty that transcended their dire circumstances. She nodded, gathering her resolve once more. "What's our next move?" "We follow the high country," Nijoni replied, pointing to a distant ridgeline. "More difficult but safer. Men like Rawlins think like hunters, not like the hunted. They follow easy paths, expect others to do the same." It was a strategy born of Nijoni's people's long experience, evading military patrols and hostile tribes. Move where the enemy least expects. Travel when they believe you must rest. Choose paths they consider impossible. They continued their journey along the escarpment as the afternoon sun began its westward descent. The terrain was challenging but not impossible, and Beth found herself gaining confidence in the moccasin's grip on the rocky surface. Nijoni maintained a measured pace, neither too slow to make progress nor too fast to sustain. After several hours of travel, she led them to a narrow crevice in the mountainside, a crack barely wide enough for them to squeeze through sideways. Inside, the space opened surprisingly into a small but adequate cave, invisible from more than a few feet away. "Good place to sleep," Nijoni said, inspecting the space. "Hidden. Defensible." She directed Beth to gather the few sparse plants that grew near the entrance while she arranged their meager supplies. Night was falling rapidly, bringing with it the desert's characteristic temperature drop. Without a fire, they would need to rely on shared body heat and the rabbit fur robe to survive the night's chill. As darkness claimed the land, they huddled together in the cave's inner recess, the robe wrapped around both of them. Despite her initial embarrassment at such intimacy with a stranger, Beth soon found herself grateful for Nijoni's warmth against the penetrating cold. "Will they continue searching at night?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, though there was no one to hear them in this remote location. "No," Nijoni replied with certainty. "Even Rawlins not foolish enough to track in darkness. They will camp, begin again at dawn. Then we have until morning. Yes, we should sleep now, need strength for tomorrow." But sleep proved elusive. Despite Beth's exhaustion, her mind raced with questions about their pursuers, their destination, and the child that grew within her. A child who would be born into a world far different from the one she had envisioned when she'd set out from Philadelphia. "You think too loud," Nijoni observed after some time had passed. "Thoughts spinning like dust devils." Beth smiled ruefully into the darkness. "Is that another of your spiritual insights?" "No. Can hear your breathing change, feel your body tense and release." There was a hint of amusement in her voice. "Don't need spirits to know a troubled mind." "I'm scared," Beth admitted. the confession easier in the darkness. Not just of Rawlins and his men, of what comes after. If we reach your people, if we don't. I'm carrying a child with no father, no home, no future, I can see clearly. Nijoni was silent for a long moment, and Beth wondered if she'd offended her with such personal concerns in the midst of their life or death flight. When I was young, Nijoni finally said, her voice soft but clear in the darkness, my grandmother told me that fear is like looking at your feet while walking. You see only the next step, the next stone, the next hole. You stumble because your vision is too small. She shifted slightly, adjusting the robe around them. Courage is lifting your eyes to the horizon, seeing not just where you are, but where you might go. The path becomes clearer when you see more of it. But what if there is no path? Beth asked. What if every direction leads to more danger? Then you make a path, Nijoni said simply. Like water finding its way through stone, persistent, patient, but unstoppable. The cave fell silent again, but Beth found Nijoni's words settling into her consciousness, not as platitudes, but as a wisdom born of genuine experience. The experience of a people who had faced annihilation, yet continued to find their way forward, to maintain their identity, to survive. Thank you, she murmured, for everything. Nijoni's only response was a gentle touch on Beth's arm. Acknowledgement, reassurance, perhaps even the beginnings of friendship. It was enough. Beth finally drifted into sleep, her dreams not of pursuit or danger, but of flowing water carving its determined path through solid stone. Morning arrived with an unwelcome sound, the distant but unmistakable whinny of a horse. Nijoni was instantly alert, her hand covering Beth's mouth before she could speak. They listened intently, barely breathing. Another horse, closer this time, followed by the muffled sound of men's voices. Nijoni's eyes met Beth's in the dim light filtering through the narrow cave entrance. They had been found, or soon would be. Without a word, she began gathering their few possessions, movements deliberate and silent. Beth followed her example, rolling the fur robe with hands that trembled slightly but remained functional. When everything was secured, Nijoni moved to the cave entrance and peered cautiously through the narrow opening. She watched for several minutes, then withdrew, her expression grave. 2 riders, she whispered. Following the ridge we walked yesterday. We'll find our tracks soon. What do we do? Beth asked, keeping her voice equally low. Nijoni considered their options, her dark eyes calculating. They expect us to run east, toward Diné camp. She nodded to herself, decision made. So, we go west. Back toward the raiders' territory? Beth couldn't keep the alarm from her voice. For short distance only, then north, through Thunder Canyon. Path very few know. It was a desperate gamble, intentionally moving closer to danger, in order to ultimately escape it. Yet Beth trusted Nijoni's knowledge of the land and their pursuers. If she believed this was their best chance, then it likely was. They squeezed through the narrow cave entrance, emerging into the early morning light. Instead of continuing along the ridge as they had the previous day, Nijoni led them down a treacherous scree slope, using the loose rock to avoid leaving distinct footprints. The descent was nerve-wracking, each sliding step threatening to send Beth tumbling uncontrollably down the steep incline. When they reached the bottom, Nijoni guided them into a dry wash, a sandy creek bed that filled only during the infrequent desert rains. Here, the wind would quickly erase any tracks they left, making pursuit much more difficult. They moved as swiftly as Beth's condition allowed, putting distance between themselves and the searchers on the ridge above. The wash curved westward, through increasingly narrow sandstone walls, finally opening into a broader canyon where scattered ponderosa pines provided the first real cover they'd had since leaving the cave. Thunder Canyon ahead, Nijoni said, pointing to a dark line that cut through the distant mesa. "If we reach it before midday, we have chance." Beth nodded, summoning her remaining reserves of strength. The morning grew warmer as the sun climbed higher, and she found herself grateful for the water skin Nijoni had insisted on filling at a small seep the previous evening. The liquid was brackish, but wonderfully wet against her parched throat. They had covered perhaps 2 miles when Nijoni suddenly stiffened, raising her hand in warning. Beth froze, straining to hear what had alerted her companion. Then she caught the distant rumble of hoofbeats coming not from behind them as expected, but from ahead. "More riders," Nijoni confirmed grimly. "Rawlins divides his men, surrounds us." They pressed themselves against the canyon wall, using a cluster of boulders for concealment as they waited to see if the approaching riders would pass them by. Beth's heart hammered in her chest, fear a metallic taste in her mouth. The child, within her, shifted restlessly, responding to her tension. The riders came into view. 3 men on dust-covered horses, moving at an easy trot as they scanned the canyon floor for signs of passage. Unlike the men they'd spotted earlier, these made no attempt to disguise their purpose. They were hunters, and their prey was human. The storm continued through the night, rain drumming against the rock overhang as lightning split the sky in brilliant flashes. Beth slept fitfully. The herbal medicine Nijoni had given her lending strength, but not peace of mind. Each crack of thunder jolted her awake, momentarily disoriented in the darkness, until the next lightning flash illuminated Nijoni's vigilant silhouette at the edge of their shelter. By dawn, the storm had moved on, leaving behind a transformed landscape glistening with moisture. Puddles dotted the mesa top, and the junipers seemed to stand taller, revitalized by the night's bounty. Nijoni moved quietly around their small camp, gathering edible plants that had emerged following the rainfall. "Storm washed away our tracks," she announced as Beth stirred. "Good medicine for hunted ones." She handed Beth several small bulbs. "Dessert onion. Eat, gives strength." Beth ate the pungent bulbs without complaint, having learned to trust Nijoni's knowledge of wild foods. The nourishment, simple as it was, revitalized her tired body. She stretched cautiously, assessing her condition. The desperate exhaustion of the previous day had receded, though a bone-deep weariness remained. "How far to your people now?" she asked. Nijoni considered, calculating their position against landmarks visible in the morning light. 2 days, maybe 3, depends. On what? On whether Rawlins' men found new tracks, on whether we must hide more or can walk more. She shouldered her pack, adjusting the straps with practiced movements. On whether your feet and spirit hold strong. There was no judgment in the observation, merely practical assessment. Beth appreciated the honesty. In her condition, she was undeniably the limiting factor in their journey. Yet Nijoni never treated her as a burden, only as a fellow traveler with different capacities. They set out across the mesa, taking advantage of the firm footing and scattered tree cover. Nijoni set a sustainable pace, occasionally pointing out signs of wildlife or useful plants as they traveled. The unrelenting vigilance of previous days eased slightly, with the knowledge that the storm had obscured their trail, allowing brief moments of normalcy in their otherwise desperate flight. "What will happen when we reach your camp?" Beth asked during a rest break beneath a massive old juniper. "First, healing," Nijoni replied, handing her a water skin. "You need rest. Good food, medicine for the child." She studied Beth's face with clinical assessment. "Then counsel. Chief Standing Cloud will hear your witness words." "And then?" Nijoni's expression grew more guarded. "Depends on council decision. Maybe send warriors to Fort Collins with you. Maybe send message to Indian agent. Maybe..." She left the final possibility unspoken, but Beth understood. Maybe they would determine that her testimony posed too great a risk to their community, that harboring a white witness to Rawlins' crimes would bring retribution down upon them all. "I won't endanger your people," Beth said quietly. "If it's best for me to continue to Fort Collins alone, I'll understand." Nijoni shook her head firmly. "Not alone. Not now." She touched Beth's rounded belly lightly. "Responsibility not just to witness truth, but to protect new life. My people understand this duty." They continued their journey throughout the day, gradually descending from the mesa into more varied terrain. By late afternoon, they reached a small valley nestled between sandstone ridges, where a spring-fed creek supported a surprising abundance of vegetation. "Good place for night," Nizoni declared, leading them to a protected spot where several large boulders created a natural windbreak. Water, food plants, hidden from far eyes. While Beth rested, Nizoni foraged along the creek, returning with an impressive harvest. Watercress, cattail roots, and even 3 small fish she had somehow managed to catch with nothing but a sharpened stick. She prepared a meal more substantial than anything they'd eaten since beginning their journey, cooking the fish over a small, nearly smokeless fire. As twilight settled over the landscape, Beth found herself studying her companion with renewed curiosity. Despite days of travel together, Nijoni remained somewhat enigmatic, revealing her knowledge and skills, freely but little of her personal history beyond the brief fragments she'd shared. "Do you have family at the winter camp?" Beth asked. As they ate, Nijoni nodded. "Sister Luyu. She is also healer. Brother's son, Kame. His wife expects child soon, like you." A shadow passed across her features. "Had husband once. Died in soldier attack many seasons ago." "I'm sorry," Beth said softly. Nijoni acknowledged the sympathy with a slight inclination of her head. "Your husband?" she asked. "Also dead." Beth hesitated, then decided that after all Nijoni had done for her, honesty was the least she owed. "I have no husband, never did." She placed her hand protectively over her belly. "In Philadelphia, I trusted someone I shouldn't have. When I told him about the child, he denied responsibility, said no one would believe me over him." She expected judgment, had certainly received enough of it in Philadelphia, but Nizoni's expression remained neutral. "Men often deny what they create," she observed matter-of-factly. "Think consequences belong only to women." She gestured to Beth's condition. "But child has no blame in this, comes to world innocent. That's why I was traveling west," Beth explained, "to start somewhere new, where my child wouldn't carry the burden of scandal." Nijoni nodded understanding. "New beginnings. Good. Medicine for wounded spirits." She added a small branch to their fire. "My people believe children choose their mothers before birth. Your child chose you, knowing path would be difficult." The concept was utterly foreign to Beth's Protestant upbringing, yet strangely comforting in its shift of perspective, suggesting purpose rather than misfortune in her circumstances. As full darkness descended, Nijoni extinguished their small fire, leaving only starlight to illuminate their camp. The night was clear after the previous day's storm, the sky a vast canvas of brilliant points against infinite blackness. Beth found herself marveling at the display, so different from Philadelphia's smoky, lantern-lit nights. "So many," she breathed, gazing upward. "Star people," Nijoni said, following her gaze. "Ancient ones who watch over Earth. Each has story, purpose." She pointed to a distinctive constellation. 7 dancers. They guide travelers home. She began softly relating the Navajo understanding of the night sky, stories of how the stars came to be, which ones guided planting or hunting, which heralded changing seasons. Beth listened, entranced by this different way of seeing the cosmos, not as distant celestial bodies to be measured and catalogued as her scientific education had taught, but as living presences with whom humanity maintained relationship. The peaceful interlude ended abruptly when Nijoni stiffened, her narrative cutting off mid-sentence. Beth instantly fell silent, attuned now to her companion's acute senses. For long moments, they sat motionless, straining to detect whatever had triggered Nijoni's alarm. Then Beth heard it too, the distant but unmistakable sound of men's voices carried on the night air. Not nearby perhaps, but certainly within the same valley. Rawlins' hunters had managed to pick up their trail, despite the storm's interference. Without a word, Nijoni began gathering their few possessions, movements swift and silent in the darkness. Beth followed her example, heart pounding as she rolled the rabbit fur robe and secured the water skin. Within minutes, they were ready to move, their brief respite shattered by the renewed threat of pursuit. Nijoni led them away from their camp in the opposite direction from the voices, using the starlight to navigate across the valley floor. They moved as quietly as possible, but Beth's pregnancy made complete silence impossible. Each snapped twig or dislodged stone seemed magnified in the night's stillness, surely betraying their position to any listening ears. They had covered perhaps half a mile when the voices grew suddenly louder, accompanied now by the distinctive sounds of horses being unsaddled and a camp being established. Their pursuers had stopped for the night, apparently unaware how close they were to their quarry. Nijoni pulled Beth into the shadow of a large boulder, both women breathing as shallowly as possible as they listened to the raiders' conversations. "Dirty waste of time," one voice complained. "Woman's probably dead in the desert by now." "Shut your mouth," came the sharp reply, a voice Beth recognized as belonging to the scarred man called Thorn. Rawlins wants confirmation, not guesswork. Besides, that Navajo witch knows these canyons. They could still be alive. Even if they are, what's the harm? A third voice asked. Who's going to believe some knocked-up schoolteacher and an Indian over respectable businessmen? Thorne's response was coldly precise. Rawlins doesn't deal in probably or what, if. He deals in certainties. No witnesses means no questions. No questions means we keep working both sides against the middle. A pause. Now get some sleep. We ride at first light. As the camp quieted, Nijoni signaled for them to retreat further. They edged backward carefully until they reached a dry stream bed that offered concealment for their continued flight. "They're so close," Beth whispered, unable to keep the tremor from her voice. "Good and bad," Nijoni replied softly. "Bad because danger near, good because they sleep now, giving us time to move ahead." She assessed their position, considering options. Must leave valley before dawn, find harder ground where horses struggle, leave no tracks. The rest of the night passed in grueling progression, their path taking them up a steep, rocky slope that challenged even Nijoni's strength and forced Beth to use her hands as much as her feet. Every movement required careful consideration, testing handholds before trusting weight to them, easing body and belly around jutting rocks, pausing frequently to gather strength for the next section. By the time dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they had reached the ridgeline, allowing them to look back over the valley they'd departed. In the growing light, they could see the raiders' camp, figures stirring around a small fire. From this distance, the men appeared almost ordinary, travelers enjoying morning coffee before continuing their journey. Only Beth and Nijoni knew the deadly purpose that drove them. "We cross ridge," Nijoni said. "Other side has stone path. Ancient way, Diné hunters used for many generations." The ancient path proved to be a narrow ledge cut into the cliff face, barely wide enough for single-file passage. In places, it had crumbled away completely, requiring precarious detours around the damaged sections. Beth pressed herself against the rock wall, fighting vertigo as she edged along behind Nijoni. The drop to her right plunged hundreds of feet to jagged rocks below, a fact she tried desperately to ignore. "Focus on next step only," Nijoni advised, noting her fear. "Not on fall, that hasn't happened." The practical wisdom steadied Beth's nerves enough to continue. They traversed the ledge for nearly an hour before it finally widened into a proper trail that curved downward into a new valley. This one narrower and more densely vegetated than the one they'd left behind. "Water flows here more often," Nijoni explained as they descended. "Brings different plants, different animals." She pointed to a grove of stunted cottonwoods in the distance. Sign of spring beneath ground, even if not visible on surface. They reached the valley floor as the morning heat began to build, grateful for the intermittent shade offered by the scattered vegetation. Despite the physical demands of their night journey, both women felt the need to put more distance between themselves and their pursuers before pausing for rest. As they passed the cottonwood grove, Nijoni suddenly raised her hand, signaling for Beth to stop. She stood motionless, head slightly tilted, listening to something beyond Beth's perception. Then, to Beth's surprise, she gave a low whistle that perfectly mimicked a desert quail. Silence followed, then an identical call returned from the grove. Nijoni's posture relaxed marginally, though her hand remained near the knife at her belt. "Dene hunter," she explained quietly to Beth. "Friend, I think, but stay behind me until certain." A figure emerged from the shadows of the cottonwoods, a young man dressed in a mixture of traditional Navajo clothing and pieces clearly obtained through trade with white settlers. He carried a bow and had a brace of rabbits slung over his shoulder. Upon seeing Nijoni, his face broke into a relieved smile. "Shima Sani," he greeted her, using the Navajo word for maternal grandmother as a term of respect rather than literal relationship. His eyes widened slightly as he noticed Beth standing behind her. Nijoni responded in rapid Navajo, too quick for Beth to catch any words she might have recognized from their days together. The young man listened intently, his expression growing grave. He replied at length, occasionally gesturing toward the north. After several minutes of conversation, Nijoni turned to Beth. "This is Keme, my brother's son. He hunts away from winter camp." She indicated the rabbits. "He brings important news. Rawlins' men visited our camp 3 days ago, asking questions about missing white woman." Fear tightened Beth's throat. "They know we're heading there." Nijoni nodded grimly. Chief Standing Cloud told them nothing, but they watch trails now. Camp not safe as we hoped. "What do we do?" Beth asked, the constant need to revise plans wearing against her already fragile reserves of strength. Nijoni conferred briefly with Keme again before responding. "Change direction. Keme knows place. Old trading post. Man named Cooper lives there. Friend to Dine, enemy to Rawlins." "Can we trust him?" "More than most whites," Nijoni replied with characteristic directness. "Married Pueblo woman many years ago. Understands something of our ways." Keme spoke again, his tone urgent. Nijoni's expression hardened as she listened. "What is it?" Beth asked when their exchange concluded. "Riders following our trail." Nijoni translated. "Keme saw them cross ridge as he hunted, 3 men moving fast." She shouldered her pack with renewed urgency. "We go now. Keme will lead different way." The young hunter nodded, quickly transferring the rabbits to Nijoni's pack before leading them deeper into the cottonwood grove. He moved with the confident ease of one born to the landscape, selecting a path that somehow always found the firmest ground, the best concealment, the easiest grade. Despite his careful consideration of Beth's condition, the pace he set was challenging. The day grew increasingly hot, the sun beating down with merciless intensity once they left the shelter of the grove. Beth's dress clung to her body, sweat-soaked and restrictive, her breath coming in labored gasps as they climbed a series of low hills. Just when she felt she couldn't take another step, Keme led them into the blessed shade of a narrow canyon. A trickle of water ran along its floor, not enough to be called a proper stream, but sufficient to support pockets of greenery and, most wonderfully, to wet parched throats. "Rest," Nijoni instructed as Beth sank gratefully to a boulder beside the water. Not long, but needed. While Beth drank and caught her breath, Nijoni and Kemi conferred, occasionally pointing to landscape features visible from their position. The young man seemed to be describing a route, his hands tracing paths through the air as Nijoni nodded understanding. When they finished their discussion, Kemi approached Beth with a respectful nod. "Cooper's trading post one day from here," he said, his English accented but clear. "I show path to Shimasani." He glanced at the sun's position. "Must go soon. Hunters follow fast." "Thank you," Beth said sincerely, "for helping strangers at risk to yourself." Keem's expression remained serious, but his eyes conveyed understanding. "No strangers under grandmother's protection." He touched his chest, lightly. "Dine way." Before departing, he handed Nijoni a small leather pouch from his belt. She accepted it with evident gratitude, securing it within her medicine bundle. With a final exchange of words in Navajo, Keme slipped away, moving up the canyon wall with the agility of a mountain goat until he disappeared among the rocks. "What did he give you?" Beth asked as they prepared to continue their journey. Nijoni opened her hand, revealing a small quantity of dried leaves with a distinctive pungent aroma. "Medicine plant, rare, good for women near birthing time." She tucked it carefully away. "Keme's wife will need soon. He shares with you, shows respect." Beth felt humbled by the generosity. A hunter sharing precious resources with a stranger. A white woman whose people had caused his such hardship. The simple act of sharing spoke volumes about the values that governed Nijoni's community. They followed the canyon for several miles, its twisting course providing natural concealment and occasional water. By mid-afternoon, they emerged into more open country, a landscape of scattered mesas and isolated buttes rising from grassy flats. "Cooper's trading post beyond that rise," Nijoni said, pointing to a distant plateau. "Hard walking still, but path clearer now." As they crossed the open ground, Beth found herself scanning the horizon frequently, expecting at any moment to see riders appear against the sky. The exposure after days of seeking concealment left her feeling vulnerable, though Nijoni assured her that Keme had led them to a route rarely traveled by either natives or settlers. The sun was low in the western sky when they finally approached the trading post, a squat stone building nestled against the base of a sandstone cliff. Weathered corrals stood empty beside it, and a thin wisp of smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting occupation, despite the lack of visible activity. Nijoni approached cautiously, signaling for Beth to remain slightly behind her as they neared the building. When they were perhaps 50 yards away, the door swung open. An elderly man with a long grey beard and weathered face emerged, a rifle held casually but noticeably in his gnarled hands. Recognition flickered in his rheumy eyes when he spotted Nijoni. "Well now," he called in a voice roughened by age and solitude. "Didn't expect to see you this season, medicine woman. Thought you'd be with your people at the winter camp by now." His gaze shifted to Beth, widening slightly at her condition. "And with interesting company, I see." "Jeremiah Cooper," Nijoni acknowledged, with a slight nod. "Woman needs rest. Safe place." The old trapper lowered his rifle, studying them both with shrewd assessment. "Trouble?" "Raiders," Nijoni confirmed simply. "Richardson wagon train, all dead except her." Cooper cursed softly, his expression darkening. "Rawlins' work?" "Think so. Same marks." The exchange confirmed Beth's suspicion that the pattern of violence was well established and recognized by those who lived in these territories, even as official investigation seemed non-existent. Cooper turned his attention to Beth. "You witnessed it, ma'am?" "Yes," she confirmed, her voice steady. "I was gathering kindling when they attacked. Saw everything." The trapper whistled softly. "Then you're carrying more than just that baby. You're carrying the truth Rawlins would kill to silence." He stepped back, gesturing toward his cabin. "Better come inside. Got stew on the fire and plenty to discuss." The cabin's interior was surprisingly neat for a man living alone in the wilderness. A table and chairs, crafted from rough timber, occupied the center of the main room. Shelves lined with supplies, books, and curious artifacts covered one wall. A small pot of savory-smelling stew bubbled over the hearth. Cooper busied himself, setting out wooden bowls, while Beth sank gratefully onto a chair. Nijoni remained standing, her posture suggesting discomfort with the confined space. "Been tracking Rawlins' activities for 3 years," Cooper explained as he ladled stew into the bowls. "Started small, robbing lone travelers, small wagon groups. Graduated to bigger targets, playing both sides against the middle." He shook his head disgustedly. "Army blames Indians. Indians blame the army or settlers. Meanwhile, Rawlins' men get richer, and the territory gets more dangerous for everyone." "You've reported this?" Beth asked, accepting the steaming bowl with gratitude. Cooper snorted. "To whom, Mom? Local authorities are a 3 days ride in good weather. Army officers are more interested in putting Indians on reservations than catching white men masquerading as Indians. And the territorial governor's office is too busy preparing for statehood to worry about frontier justice." "Then nothing can be done." The prospect was intolerable to Beth after all she had witnessed, all she had endured. "Didn't say that," Cooper replied, sitting across from her. "Truth has power if it reaches the right ears." He glanced at Nijoni. "Which is why you're taking her to your winter camp, I reckon. Chief Standing Cloud still has that connection to the Indian Agency superintendent. What's his name?" "Thomas Jenkins," Nijoni replied. "Friend to Dine many winters. Listens when others don't." Cooper nodded. "Smart thinking. Jenkins has the governor's ear, they say. If he believes your story," he addressed Beth directly, "there might be an official investigation. Might even be enough to bring Rawlins to justice." As they ate, Cooper provided crucial information about recent movements in the territory. A cavalry patrol had passed through 5 days earlier, heading west toward Fort Collins. Rawlins and a larger group of his men had been spotted near Wilson's trading post 30 miles south. "Most telling is what came through yesterday," Cooper added, refilling their bowls. "2 of Rawlins' scouts asking if I'd seen any survivors from a wagon train attacked by bloodthirsty Navajo." His eyes narrowed. "Offered a reward for information, said the savages took a woman captive." Beth and Nijoni exchanged glances, understanding the implications. The raiders weren't just eliminating witnesses, they were laying groundwork for another false narrative, one that would further inflame tensions between settlers and natives. "They know someone survived," Beth said quietly, "and they're setting the stage for blame," Nijoni added grimly. Cooper rose and moved to a crude map tacked to his wall. "You'll need to avoid the main trails completely now. Rawlins' men will be watching them." He traced a route with his finger. "This old game trail leads through the high country. Difficult traveling, especially in your condition, ma'am, but it'll keep you well clear of likely search areas." As he marked the trail, a sharp crack sounded from outside, a branch breaking beneath a heavy foot. Cooper froze, his hand dropping instinctively to the knife at his belt. Nijoni moved swiftly to the cabin's single window, peering cautiously. Through the grimy glass, "Riders," she said, voice low. 3 armed." Cooper cursed. "Back door, through the root cellar." He moved quickly, lifting a trapdoor concealed beneath a worn rug. Tunnel leads to the stream bank. Dug it when Blackfoot was troublesome years back. He grabbed a pack from a hook, shoving provisions inside with practiced efficiency. Take this. Jerky, cornmeal and salt pork. Coffee too, though I reckon that's more comfort than necessity. Nijoni was already guiding Beth toward the trapdoor. The dark opening below seemed ominous, but the approaching hoofbeats left no time for hesitation. "What about you?" Beth asked Cooper as Nijoni helped her onto the ladder. The old trapper smiled grimly. "Been playing a simple old fool to men like Rawlins for years. They won't suspect I've helped you." He pressed a folded paper into her hand. "Map to the high trail. Godspeed, ma'am." The last thing Beth saw before descending into the darkness was Cooper casually arranging himself by the fire, his rifle, just out of sight, but within easy reach. Nijoni taught Beth the chorus of the song, guiding her through the unfamiliar syllables until she could join in the calming melody. As they sang together, the child's movements gentled, as if listening to their harmonized voices. The peaceful moment shattered when Nijoni suddenly stiffened, her hand flying up in a gesture for silence. Beth froze, straining to hear what had alerted her. Then she caught it, the faint sound of voices carried on the mountain breeze, too distant to distinguish words, but clearly human. Nijoni moved silently to the cliff edge, peering cautiously around the rock face. "3 riders," she reported in a whisper, "at the stream crossing below. Others must have split up, searching different trails." Beth joined her at the vantage point. Far below, she could make out 3 mounted figures examining the ground near where they had rested earlier. One man pointed up the trail they had taken, while another dismounted to investigate something in the dirt. "They found our trail," she whispered, fear tightening her throat. Nijoni nodded grimly. "Good trackers. We'll find path to cliff dwelling soon. What do we do?" She considered their options, dark eyes scanning the terrain with practiced assessment. Wait until they start climbing, then move along the back path. She pointed to a barely visible track that skirted the rear of the cliff dwelling. "Leads to high meadow, forest beyond." The plan carried obvious risks. The rear path looked treacherous, and they would be exposed during the crossing to the forest. But remaining meant certain discovery. Beth nodded her agreement, gathering their few possessions with shaking hands. They waited in tense silence as the riders began their ascent of the trail. When the men had climbed perhaps a third of the way, too committed to easily turn back, but not close enough to spot movement at the cliff dwelling, Nijoni signaled it was time to move. The rear path proved even narrower than it had appeared, in places little more than a ledge, wide enough for single-file passage. Beth pressed herself against the rock face, fighting vertigo as she edged along behind Nijoni. The drop to her right plunged hundreds of feet to jagged rocks below, a fact she tried desperately to ignore. They had nearly reached the end of the exposed section when disaster struck. A loose stone shifted beneath Beth's foot, clattering down the cliff face in a miniature avalanche that echoed across the mountainside. "There! The cliff!" a voice shouted from below. "Someone's up there!" Nijoni grabbed Beth's arm, pulling her forward with urgent haste. "Run! Forest edge!" They abandoned caution for speed, racing across the high meadow toward the tree line some 200 yards distant. Behind them, shouts indicated the pursuers had spotted their flight and were changing course to intercept. The meadow's tall grass whipped at Beth's legs as she ran, her pregnancy making each stride awkward and laborious. Nijoni matched her pace to hers, one hand gripping her elbow to steady her when she stumbled. A rifle crack split the air. Dirt kicked up 10 feet to their left, a warning shot deliberately wide of the mark. "Stop right there!" a voice commanded. "Next one won't miss." Nijoni pulled Beth behind a large boulder at the meadow's edge, momentarily breaking the pursuers' line of sight. "Keep running," she instructed urgently. "Straight into trees. Don't stop. Don't look back. Beth realized with horror what she intended. No, I won't leave you to face them alone. Not alone, Nijoni said, reaching into her medicine pouch. She withdrew a small leather packet, unwrapping it to reveal a dark powder. With practiced movements, she rubbed it across her forehead and cheekbones in distinctive lines. Spirits of our ancestors, stand with me. The transformation was subtle but profound. The gentle healer seemed to recede, replaced by something more primal, a warrior preparing to defend what she was sworn to protect. Your truth is more important than life, she insisted, pressing the horned toad carving into Beth's palm. Go, find my people, tell what happened. Before Beth could argue further, Nijoni stepped from behind the boulder, moving laterally away from her position, deliberately drawing attention and fire from Beth's escape route. Looking for me, Bilagana? She called in deliberate challenge. Come then! The distraction worked. The three pursuers immediately focused on the more visible target, spurring their horses toward Nijoni's position. Beth hesitated only a moment before forcing herself to do as instructed, using the diversion to make for the forest edge. She reached the trees as the first shots were exchanged, the sharp report of rifles echoing across the meadow. Every instinct screamed for her to turn back, to not abandon the woman who had saved her repeatedly. But the child within her kicked forcefully, a reminder of her greater responsibility. With tears blurring her vision, Beth plunged deeper into the forest, following. The direction Nijoni had indicated would lead toward the Navajo winter camp. The sounds of conflict gradually faded behind her, replaced by the soft susurration of pine needles and her own labored breathing. She had traveled perhaps half a mile when a new sound froze her in place, hoofbeats approaching rapidly through the trees. Beth ducked behind a massive ponderosa pine, pressing herself against its rough bark as she frantically surveyed her surroundings for a hiding place or weapon. The rider burst into view, a stocky man with a red beard, rifle at the ready, one of Rawlins' men, separated from the others to flank their quarry. His gaze swept the forest systematically, missing Beth's position by mere yards on his first pass. She held her breath, willing herself to absolute stillness. The horned toad carving dug into her palm where she clutched it, its edges sharp against her skin. The rider turned his horse, preparing for another sweep of the area. This time his gaze locked directly on her hiding place. A slow, predatory smile spread across his bearded face. Well now, he drawled, leveling his rifle. Look what we have here. The missing witness, I presume. Beth's mind raced through diminishing options. Running was futile in her condition. Fighting seemed equally hopeless against an armed man. Yet surrender meant certain death, if not immediately, then after Rawlins extracted whatever information he wanted. The rider dismounted, keeping his rifle trained on her position. Come, on out, ma'am. Make this easier on both of us. With no alternative, Beth stepped from behind the tree, one hand protectively covering her belly, the other still clutching the horned toad carving. The man's eyes widened slightly at her obvious pregnancy, then narrowed calculatingly. Interesting situation you got yourself in, he observed, keeping his distance but blocking any route of escape. Boss is going to be mighty curious about you, especially how you managed to give us the slip after the wagon train. Your boss is a murderer, Beth responded, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. A coward who kills innocents and blames others. The man shrugged, untroubled by the accusation. Business is business, ma'am. Nothing personal. He gestured with the rifle. Now, we're going to walk nice and easy back to where my friends are dealing with your Indian companion. At the mention of Nijoni, fresh fear surged through Beth. Was she already dead, captured, or still fighting against impossible odds? Move, the man ordered, gesturing toward the meadow with his rifle. Beth took a reluctant step forward, mind still, frantically, searching for any chance of escape. The horned toad carving bit into her palm again. reminding her of Njoni's words, "Horned toad's spirit watched over your dreams." She had dismissed it as superstition, yet now found herself silently appealing to whatever spirits might be listening. The answer came in an unexpected form. A low growl emanated from the underbrush to their right, a rumbling warning that raised the hair on Beth's neck. The rider froze, his attention diverted momentarily from his captive. The mountain lion exploded from cover in a blur of tawny fur and extended claws. Whether drawn by the scent of blood from the earlier confrontation or simply defending its territory, the predator struck with terrible precision. The rider managed one panicked shot that went wide before the big cat was upon him. Man and beast tumbled to the forest floor in a chaotic tangle of thrashing limbs and snarling fury. Beth didn't wait to witness the outcome. Seizing the moment of chaos, she fled deeper into the forest, away from both the meadow confrontation and the new danger. The sounds of struggle faded behind her as she pushed herself to maintain a pace that balanced speed with caution. For nearly an hour she continued without pause, navigating by instinct and the vague direction Njoni had provided. The forest eventually thinned, giving way to a rocky slope that overlooked a broad valley. In the distance, a river wound like a silver ribbon through the landscape. Beth paused, catching her breath as she surveyed the terrain. According to Njoni, the Navajo winter camp lay 2 days' journey east, near where the river bent around a distinctive formation she had called Sleeping Eagle. From her current vantage, she could make out what might be the formation, a long, winged ridge that indeed resembled an eagle at rest. The sight provided a moment of hope, quickly dampened by crushing reality. She was alone in the wilderness once more, without guidance, with minimal supplies, and now pursued by determined enemies. Njoni's fate remained unknown, but she feared the worst given the odds she had faced. The child moved within her, a gentle reminder of her responsibility to continue regardless of the mounting obstacles. "We'll make it," she promised softly, pressing her hand against the movement. "For her, for the truth, we'll make it." As the sun began its westward descent, Beth picked her way down the rocky slope toward the valley floor. Each step presented a calculated risk. Moving brought her closer to potential safety, but increased the chance of being spotted if pursued. Remaining stationary meant certain exposure once night fell and temperatures plummeted. She had nearly reached the valley floor when a distant sound carried on the breeze, the whinny of a horse followed by men's voices. Beth ducked into a stand of junipers, heart pounding as she scanned the direction of the sound. Riders emerged from the forest edge she had exited perhaps an hour earlier. Not 3, but 5 mounted men, moving with the deliberate pace of those following a trail. Even at this distance, she could see they carried weapons at the ready. More alarmingly, they had a 6th horse in tow, riderless but bearing what appeared to be a body draped across the saddle. Njoni. Beth pressed her fist against her mouth to stifle a cry of anguish. Whether dead or merely wounded, her capture confirmed Beth's worst fears. The sacrifice she had made to ensure Beth's escape now seemed both heroic and futile if she couldn't reach her people with the truth they both carried. As she watched, the riders conferred briefly before splitting into 2 groups, 3 continuing along her trail, 2 breaking off to head directly across the valley. The pincer movement would effectively cut off her route to the east unless she could somehow evade both parties. Night approached, bringing both danger and opportunity. Darkness would make tracking more difficult for her pursuers, but would also increase the challenges of navigation and safe passage for herself. Beth surveyed her surroundings with new urgency, seeking any advantage the terrain might offer. The valley floor featured scattered copses of trees interspersed with open meadows, poor cover for daylight travel, but potentially navigable under darkness if she could avoid the searchers until then. To the south, foothills rose toward more mountainous terrain, offering better concealment but potentially leading her away from her destination. As Beth deliberated, a new sound reached her, distant but distinct thunder. She glanced skyward to see dark clouds building on the western horizon, advancing rapidly toward the valley. The approaching storm might provide cover, but also threatened exposure to the elements without adequate shelter. Decision crystallized through necessity. Beth would wait until the storm broke, using its fury as concealment to cross the exposed sections of valley under the cover of darkness and driving rain. The gambit carried obvious risks, but offered the best chance of breaking the tightening circle of pursuers. Finding a depression beneath the gnarled roots of a massive juniper, Beth huddled into the makeshift shelter. She wrapped Cooper's pack around her shoulders for additional warmth and extracted the last of the jerky to sustain her through what promised to be a challenging night. As daylight faded and the first rumbles of thunder growled overhead, Beth found herself gripping the horned toad carving, turning it repeatedly in her fingers like a talisman. Nizoni's belief in its protective power now seemed less foreign, less dismissible than it had days before. "Watch over us tonight," she whispered to the carving, to whatever spirits might be listening. "Help me reach your people with the truth." Ooh, the storm broke with sudden fury, just as darkness claimed the valley. Lightning split the sky in jagged forks, momentarily illuminating the landscape in stark relief before plunging it back into deeper blackness. Rain fell in blinding sheets, driven by gusting winds that bent the junipers like supplicants before a wrathful god. In this elemental chaos, Elizabeth Hoffman emerged from hiding to continue her desperate journey eastward toward a people not her own, but who represented her last hope for justice and survival. The storm raged throughout the night, a chaotic symphony of thunder, lightning, and driving rain that transformed the valley into a treacherous quagmire. Beth pushed eastward through the darkness, using the frequent lightning flashes to orient herself toward the distant, but that marked the vicinity of the Navajo winter camp. By dawn, the storm had moved on, leaving behind a transformed landscape, glistening with moisture beneath the rising sun. Beth emerged from a thicket where she had taken brief shelter during the worst of the deluge. Her dress clung to her body, sodden and heavy, and her hair hung in dripping tangles around her face. Yet the physical discomfort paled against her small victory. She had successfully traversed the exposed valley floor under cover of the storm's fury. From her new vantage point at the edge of a pine forest, she could see no immediate signs of pursuit. Whether Rawlins' men had abandoned the search during the tempest or simply lost her trail in the rain-washed terrain remained unclear. Either possibility offered only temporary reprieve. Beth allowed herself a brief rest, rationing the last of Cooper's provisions while she assessed her situation. The sleeping eagle appeared closer now, perhaps a day's journey if she maintained a steady pace. The challenge would be approaching. The Navajo camp, without being mistaken for a threat, especially now that she no longer had Nizoni to vouch for her presence. The thought of the Navajo healer sent a fresh wave of grief through her. The image of her body draped across the saddle haunted Beth, along with the uncertainty of her fate. Was she dead? Captured? What horrors might she be enduring even now because she had chosen to protect Beth? Beth closed her fingers around the horned toad carving, drawing resolve from the connection it represented. Nizoni had entrusted her with reaching her people, with sharing the truth about Rawlins' activities. She would not fail that trust, whatever the cost. With renewed determination, she continued eastward, following the course of the river that Nizoni had identified as leading toward the winter camp. The walking was easier here than in the mountains, though she remained vigilant for signs of pursuit or other dangers. The wilderness had taught her harsh lessons about complacency. By midday, Beth had covered significant ground. The sleeping eagle now dominated the eastern horizon, its distinctive shape unmistakable against the sky. She paused at a small tributary to refill the waterskin Cooper had provided, grateful for the old trapper's foresight in equipping her with essentials. As she knelt beside the stream, movement on the opposite bank caught her attention. A doe, and fawn drinking from the clear water, unaware of her presence. The peaceful tableau struck Beth as incongruous amid the danger and desperation of recent days. For a moment, she simply watched the animals, appreciating their graceful forms and the evident bond between mother and offspring. The moment shattered when the doe's head jerked up, ears pivoting towards some sound beyond Beth's perception. In an instant, both animals bounded away, vanishing into the underbrush with barely a rustle of vegetation to mark their passage. Beth froze, straining to detect what had alarmed the deer. The answer came swiftly, hoofbeats approaching from the west, still distant but drawing nearer. She scrambled up the bank, seeking cover among the trees that lined the tributary. From her concealed position, Beth watched 3 riders emerge into the small clearing by the stream, Rawlins' men following her trail despite the storm's interference. They dismounted to water their horses, conversing in tones too low for her to distinguish words. One man knelt to examine the muddy bank where she had filled her waterskin, pointing out the fresh disturbance to his companions. Beth retreated deeper into the forest, moving as silently as possible away from the tributary. Her earlier route along the river's edge was now compromised. She would need to travel through dense forest to evade her pursuers, even if it meant a less direct path to her destination. For hours, she pushed through increasingly difficult terrain, angling northeast through pine forest that gradually gave way to more open woodland. The detour lengthened her journey, but allowed her to maintain distance from the riders, whose occasional far-off voices confirmed they continued to search the more obvious route along the river. As afternoon waned toward evening, Beth finally emerged from the forest edge to find herself facing an unexpected obstacle. A steep ravine some 30 feet deep and twice as wide, its sides eroded by the previous night's downpour. The gap extended as far as she could see in either direction, effectively blocking her eastward progress unless she found a crossing point. Exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her as she surveyed this new setback. Her body, while remarkably resilient, given her condition and experiences, had limits that couldn't be ignored indefinitely. The child within her moved restlessly, as if sensing her distress. "Just a little longer," Beth murmured, one hand pressed against her belly. "We're almost there." Following the ravine northward, she eventually discovered a place where a fallen pine created a natural bridge across the gap. The massive trunk spanned the ravine at a slight upward angle, its upper branches still adorned with browning needles where they rested on the far bank. Beth studied the makeshift crossing with trepidation. The tree appeared solid enough to bear her weight, but its rain-slicked bark offered treacherous footing. A fall from that height could prove fatal to both her and her unborn child. The sound of distant voices made the decision for her. Rawlins' men were drawing closer, perhaps having cut across country when they lost her trail by the river. The crossing, dangerous as it was, represented her only option for continued eastward progress. Taking a deep breath, Beth began the precarious journey across the trunk. She moved with painful slowness, centering her weight carefully with each step, using smaller branches as handholds where possible. Halfway across, the trunk shifted slightly beneath her weight, sending a shower of bark fragments into the ravine below. Beth froze, heart hammering against her ribs as she waited for the tree to settle. When no further movement occurred, she continued forward with even greater caution, every muscle tense with concentration. Reaching the far side brought momentary relief, quickly tempered by the realization that her pursuers would eventually discover the same crossing. She needed to put as much distance as possible between herself and the ravine before nightfall. The terrain beyond the ravine rose gradually toward the sleeping eagle, which now loomed larger against the darkening eastern sky. Beth estimated she had perhaps another half-day's journey to reach the vicinity of the Navajo camp if she could maintain her pace and avoid further encounters with Rawlins' men. As daylight faded, Beth found herself in a landscape of scattered rock formations interspersed with stands of aspen and juniper. The undulating terrain offered decent concealment, but complicated navigation in the gathering darkness. She would need to find shelter for the night, a defensible position where she could rest without exposing herself to predators of either the animal or human variety. A cluster of massive boulders presented the best option, a natural formation with a small protected space at its center, accessible only through a narrow gap between two towering stones. Beth squeezed through the opening to find an area just large enough to lie down, sheltered from wind and direct line of sight from the surrounding terrain. Using the last of the daylight, she gathered a small amount of dry grass for bedding and checked her dwindling supplies. The water skin remained half full, but Cooper's provisions were exhausted. Tomorrow would bring the additional challenge of hunger unless she could forage successfully along the way. As darkness claimed the land, Beth huddled in her stone sanctuary, drawing Cooper's pack around her shoulders for warmth. The temperature was dropping rapidly with nightfall, a reminder that even late autumn in the mountains could bring dangerously cold nights. Sleep proved elusive despite her exhaustion. Each sound from the darkness beyond her shelter brought fresh tension. The cry of a hunting owl, the distant howl of wolves, the rustle of wind through aspen leaves that too closely resembled footsteps. More troubling than these natural sounds was the absence of human voices or hoofbeats. Had Rawlins' men made camp for the night, or were they continuing their pursuit under cover of darkness? When sleep finally came, it brought disjointed dreams. The Richardson wagon train burning, Nizhoni singing the medicine song for her child, Philadelphia drawing rooms filled with whispering society matrons pointing accusatory fingers at her swollen belly. Beth woke repeatedly, disoriented and anxious, until physical exhaustion finally dragged her into deeper slumber near dawn. The new day broke clear and cool, sunlight filtering through the gap in the boulders to warm Beth's face. She stirred, slowly, every muscle protesting the previous day's exertions and the hard ground beneath her. As consciousness fully returned, so did awareness of her situation, the proximity of her goal, the dangers that still pursued her, the responsibility she carried. Emerging from her stone shelter, Beth surveyed the terrain ahead. The sleeping eagle dominated the landscape, much closer now than it had appeared the previous evening. Between her position and the butte lay rolling grassland, interspersed with clusters of trees and rock formations. Beautiful country, but with limited cover for concealed travel. After refilling her water skin at a small seep, Beth continued eastward, moving with renewed urgency. The open terrain made her nervously alert, eyes constantly scanning for movement that might indicate pursuit. By mid-morning, her vigilance was rewarded when she spotted distant riders cresting a ridge to the southwest, three mounted figures moving with the deliberate pace of trackers following a trail. Beth quickened her pace, angling toward a line of cottonwoods that followed a dry creek bed. The trees offered concealment, at least temporarily, though their distinctive presence on the landscape would make them an obvious place for searchers to investigate. As she reached the cottonwoods, a new sound carried on the breeze, the rhythmic pounding of many hooves approaching rapidly from the east. Beth pressed herself against a massive trunk, peering around its girth toward the source of the sound. Riders appeared on the horizon, moving swiftly across the grassland. Not three, but at least a dozen, their silhouettes distinct against the sky. These were not Rawlins' men. Their appearance, even at this distance, was unmistakably Navajo, with feathers and streamers adorning both riders and mounts. Beth hesitated, caught between two approaching forces. Rawlins' men from the west, Navajo riders from the east, with herself trapped in the narrow band of terrain between them. Nijoni had assured her that her people would offer protection, but that assurance had presumed her presence as intermediary. Alone, Beth represented an unknown quantity to the Navajo, potentially an enemy, or at minimum, a suspicious anomaly. Decision crystallized through necessity. Better to face potential mistrust than certain death at Rawlins' hands. Taking a deep breath, Beth stepped from the shelter of the cottonwoods into plain view, raising her arms to show she carried no weapons. The Navajo riders spotted her immediately, changing course to approach her position. They came at full gallop, spears and rifles held ready, their expressions grim beneath paint that adorned their faces in distinctive patterns of red and black. Beth stood her ground despite the intimidating display, one hand raised in what she hoped conveyed peaceful intent, the other instinctively protecting her belly. As the warriors surrounded her in a tight circle of prancing horses, she noted their defensive posture, not aggressive, but certainly wary. One rider, older than the others, with gray streaks in his braided hair and an elaborate headdress of eagle feathers, urged his mount forward. He studied Beth with piercing black eyes, set in a face lined by weather and experience. "White woman far from white places," he observed in surprisingly clear English. "Why?" Beth drew a steadying breath. "I seek the Navajo winter camp," she replied, meeting his gaze directly. "Nijoni was bringing me to speak with Chief Standing Cloud." A ripple of reaction passed through the warriors at the mention of Nijoni's name. The leader's expression sharpened with interest and suspicion. "You know our healer. Where is she now?" "Captured," Beth answered, grief tightening her throat. "Maybe killed. Men led by Victor Rawlins took her while helping me escape. Those same men follow me now." She pointed westward, where the distant riders had drawn closer during their exchange. The leader turned to follow her gesture, his eyes narrowing as he spotted the approaching figures. A rapid exchange in Navajo followed, the warriors shifting position in response to new commands. "You speak truth about being followed," the leader acknowledged, returning his attention to Beth. "But many lies come from white mouths these days. Why should Diné believe you know Nijoni?" In answer, Beth withdrew the horned toad carving from her pocket, holding it out on her palm. "She gave me this for protection, said it belonged to her mother's mother." The leader's eyes widened in recognition. He took the carving, examining it with evident familiarity before returning it to her with newfound respect. "Medicine toad," he confirmed. "Strong protection. Nijoni would not give lightly." He studied her more carefully, noting her pregnant condition. "What is your name?" "Woman who carries new life." "Elizabeth Hoffman." The leader nodded once, decision made. "I am Running Horse, War Chief Understanding Cloud. You will come with us to winter camp." He gestured to a young warrior who brought forward a riderless horse. "Those men will not follow where we go." With assistance, Beth mounted the offered horse, grateful beyond words for the reprieve from walking. 4 warriors detached from the main group, turning back toward the west to intercept Rawlins' approaching men. "What about them?" Beth asked Running Horse, who rode beside her. "They will turn back or die," he replied matter-of-factly. "Their choice." The winter camp materialized as they rounded the northern edge of the Sleeping Eagle, a sprawling village of perhaps 40 teepees, arranged in a great circle along the bend of the river. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and children paused in their play to watch the returning warriors with curious eyes. Dogs barked, an alert that brought people emerging from teepees to observe their approach. Running Horse led them directly to the center of the camp, where a larger teepee stood adorned with painted symbols and elaborate porcupine quillwork. Here, he signaled for the group to halt, dismounting with fluid grace despite his age. "Wait," he instructed Beth, disappearing into the central teepee. She remained mounted, acutely aware of the stares from all sides. Some curious, others hostile, none particularly welcoming. Women gathered in small groups, speaking softly among themselves as they assessed the strange white visitor. Children edged closer despite mothers' cautioning calls, drawn by the novelty of her appearance. One woman separated from the others, approaching Beth's horse with deliberate steps. She was perhaps 40, with strong features softened by intelligence, and an inner composure that commanded respect without demanding it. Unlike the other women who wore dresses of soft deerskin, she was dressed in a manner reminiscent of Nijoni, traditional Navajo clothing augmented with elements that suggested familiarity with white customs, including a silver cross that hung beside traditional medicine bundles around her neck. "I am Luyu," she introduced herself, her English nearly as clear as Nijoni's had been. "Sister to Nijoni." Her gaze moved to Beth's pregnant belly, then back to her face. "You say my sister helped you?" "She saved my life," Beth answered, simply. "Multiple times, she was bringing me here to tell what I witnessed, a massacre blamed on your people but committed by white raiders." Luyu's expression remained carefully controlled, though something flickered in her eyes at the mention of her sister's fate. "Where is she now?" Beth repeated what she had told Running Horse, providing more details about the confrontation in the high meadow and what she had seen afterward. As she spoke, Running Horse emerged from the central teepee, accompanied by an elderly man whose dignity and bearing immediately identified him as someone of great importance. Chief Standing Cloud moved with the measured pace of advanced age, yet his eyes remained sharp and assessing as they settled on Beth. He wore a magnificent headdress of eagle feathers that trailed nearly to the ground, and his face bore the deep lines of a life spent largely outdoors. Despite his evident age, he conveyed an aura of authority that commanded immediate respect. "Woman who comes with Nijoni's blessing," he addressed her in heavily accented but understandable English. "Running Horse says you bring truth about raiders who wear false faces." "Yes," Beth confirmed, meeting his gaze directly. "I witnessed Victor Rawlins' men massacre 17 settlers, including women and children. They wore feathers and paint to make it appear as if Navajo warriors were responsible." Standing Cloud nodded, unsurprised by the confirmation of what his people had long suspected. "Many moons we know of this Rawlins, who plays both sides against each other. The army won't listen. Indian agent writes reports that disappear in Washington." His weathered face hardened. "Now you bring news that Nijoni, my people's greatest healer, is taken by this man." "I'm sorry," Beth said, grief tightening her throat. "She sacrificed herself so I could bring the truth to you." The chief studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Truth is powerful medicine," he said finally, "but sometimes costly." Luyu took Beth's horse's bridle, steadying the animal as the pregnant woman dismounted with awkward care. "You will rest in my lodge," she said, the invitation clearly an instruction rather than an offer. "Then when council meets, they will hear your words in full." As Luyu led her through the camp toward a teepee near the central circle, Beth felt the weight of many eyes upon her. Some curious, many suspicious, a few openly hostile. She was an intruder here, regardless of Nijoni's blessing, a representative of the people who had taken Navajo land and broken Navajo trust repeatedly. Yet she also sensed something else beneath the wariness, a grudging respect for a woman who had survived alone in the wilderness, who had earned Nijoni's trust, who had brought important truth to their council despite great personal risk. Whether that respect would translate to acceptance or even to help in her desperate situation remained to be seen. For now, Beth could only honor Nijoni's sacrifice by presenting her testimony with complete honesty, whatever reception it might receive. Luyu paused before a well-maintained teepee decorated with painted symbols similar to those Beth had seen. In Nijoni's medicine pouch, "This was my sister's lodge when she stayed in winter camp," she explained, holding the entrance flap open. "Now you rest here until the council calls." Beth ducked through the low entrance, moving into a space that immediately evoked Nijoni's presence, neat, orderly, with bundles of dried plants hanging from the lodge poles and small carved fetishes arranged around a central fire pit. The familiar scent of sage and cedar brought an unexpected wave of emotion that Beth struggled to control. "She lives still," Luyu said unexpectedly, correctly interpreting Beth's reaction. "I would know if her spirit had crossed over." Her dark eyes, so similar to her sister's, held Beth's with quiet intensity. "Rest now. When the council meets, you will need all your strength to tell the story that must be told." With that cryptic reassurance, she departed, leaving Beth alone in the lodge of the woman who had saved her life. A temporary sanctuary in a community balanced on the knife edge between hospitality and hostility, where her words might bridge cultural divides or deepen existing wounds, depending on how they were received. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.